My name is Faustine Chan. I'm the Business Innovation Manager for BBB serving the Pacific Southwest. And we've been holding these daily webinars with different themes just to give business owners useful tips and education during this time to help their business excel. So we have a great speaker today. We have Rebecca Grimes. She is the Chief Marketing Officer at Ruby. She's an expert in building and leading teams through unparalleled growth. Joining the team in January 2020, she leads the sales and marketing teams to generate greater awareness around its offerings and also the value for small businesses. Through partnerships and relevant business associations, she helps build deep connection in the small business communities and also continuously explores new ways for Ruby's to address their challenges, meet their needs, and help them become successful at every stage to survive and thrive this journey. So please welcome our speaker today, Rebecca Grimes.
Thank you, Faustine, and hello everyone, and happy Friday. As you just heard, Rebecca Grimes. I joined Ruby earlier this year as their Chief Marketing Officer. And for those of you who don't know Ruby, let me give you a little background about us. Ruby is a really special company. We're a live virtual receptionist and chat company that works with over 10,000 small business owners to make meaningful connections with their most important asset, their customers, answering the phone when they can't or all the time as an extension of their team. Trusting someone to answer your phone and interact with your customers and prospective customers is a really big deal. So we take that responsibility very seriously because we know that moments matter, especially in our current reality. As Faustine mentioned, our sole purpose is to help small businesses survive and thrive. And I'm proud to work for a company that is so committed to the heart of our economy. I'm grounded by the fact that I get to wake up every day and market a service that I know now more than ever is critical for small businesses as they shift back into their offices and storefronts and get back to doing what they love. So since we're going to spend the next hour together, I thought I'd give you a little bit more background on me. First and foremost, I am a wife and a mother to a 5-year-old daughter named Olivia and a 4-year-old son named George. They're my world, they're right behind me, and I'm raising my family in a suburb of Chicago, even though Ruby is based in Portland. When I was younger, I wanted to be a reporter. So much, in fact, that I got a degree in journalism, and I was editor-in-chief of my school newspaper. And after I graduated, I spent 10 months working as a police reporter for a local newspaper in the middle of nowhere in central Illinois, where I covered the most intense stories of murder in a small town that any 21-year-old should ever have to learn early in her career about how to tell stories. So I was working 7 days a week, and I quickly realized that I needed to do something else. So I pivoted into marketing, and that's where I've spent the last 20 plus years of my career, helping companies to tell their story to prospective customers and driving growth. So now on to today's topic, leading with vulnerability. This is something I'm really passionate about. And leading with vulnerability only works when you have a culture that supports and encourages transparency, accountability, and provides a safe environment for everyone. I have been fortunate enough to have wonderful examples of great leadership to learn from throughout my career. And I've also witnessed some examples of leadership that taught me what not to do when leading a team. So in addition to learning through experiences and observation, I also spend time trying to understand what makes great leaders by engaging in conversations, observing from afar, and reading about different leadership styles that have led to greatness being achieved by their team. Today is meant to be a conversation. I've got some content to share with you, but we're going to save time at the end to have a discussion. So feel free to chat a question at any time so that you don't forget it as we're moving through the slides, and we will get to them later. All right, so let's get started. What do you think of when you think of vulnerability? For many leaders, vulnerability isn't part of their vocabulary, and in some cases, it's actually discouraged. It's often perceived as a display of insecurity, and we're taught early on that leaders need to be strong. What we've been going through lately with the pandemic is forcing even the strongest leaders to rethink what strength looks like. In the face of furloughs and layoffs and wage reductions, trust in leadership can erode if there isn't authenticity from the top about the tough decisions that are being made and the work that needs to be done to turn things around. When I think about vulnerability, it's really just a channel for open and honest communication. One of the most powerful examples in the last few weeks of leading with authenticity and vulnerability was the open letter from Airbnb's co-founder and CEO, Brian Chesky. He walked through all of the painstaking decisions that he and his leadership team had to make to lay off 25% of the company. He outlined what he was feeling, what he needed for the business, and what he was going to do for the employees that were impacted. This was about the company's strategy forever changing in response to the pandemic, and Airbnb could no longer keep those employees on its staff. And even in the face of such a tough decision, he led with full transparency, not only with his employees, but also with the world watching. And when you lead with vulnerability, the type of bond and community that you build, deeply rooted in trust, is how businesses not only survive, but they also thrive. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So an easy example to frame up vulnerability is think of it as radio communication between an aircraft carrier and members of the fleet. The carrier sends out constant beacons on its location, its speed, and conditions for landing, and pilots continually pay attention to and acknowledge receipt of those messages, and then communicate back and forth on what they're seeing. If either party encounters something that appears dangerous or unclear or off in any way, the person on the other end needs to know so the aircraft can be rerouted. The stakes are really high, and if communication breaks down, the likelihood of disaster is also pretty high. The aircraft carrier can't do what the people in the air do or what they see, and vice versa. Only by working together with strong mutual trust can members of the fleet ensure that things run smoothly and safely. So what does this look like in business? The aircraft carrier metaphor actually works really well for most businesses. Take Ruby, for example. At any given point in time, we have a dozen major projects in the air, so to speak. Those projects are all highly interconnected to each other, as well as to our biggest project, keeping the aircraft carrier running. Every project needs to land on the aircraft carrier one after another in a specific order for us to be successful. If we don't keep our channels of communication open and lean on a strong culture of trust and respect, we run the risk of colliding into each other or letting a key initiative exhaust its fuel supply and create chaos. Understanding vulnerability and culture is something many have researched, but few have actually cracked the code. And that's where Daniel Coyle comes in. In his book, The Culture Code, Coyle describes vulnerability as not only a touchy-feely display of insecurities, but as a way of sending and receiving signals. Coyle spent 4 years researching exceptionally successful groups, from bank robbers to professional basketball teams to the Navy's elite SEAL team. And the one common thread that he found was that vulnerability is what allows us to send and receive the information we need when we need it. It's how we stay tuned to each other's challenges, allowing us to offer support at a moment's notice, whether it's asked for or not. And most importantly, it cultivates trust amongst the members of our team. So what does vulnerability look like? Communicating vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean telling other people you're scared or anxious or overwhelmed, or that you feel unqualified for your job. Those feelings may be one component of the message, and arguably a really important part of the message, but they aren't the whole message. The whole message is around building a culture of belonging. And there are 3 key elements to that. You are part of this group. This group is special and has high standards, and I believe you can meet those standards. One of the most memorable quotes for me from the Culture Code was around culture, which is number 1 at the top of my priority list when I consider joining a new company. Coyle wrote, "Culture is a set of living relationships working towards a shared goal. It's not something you are, it's something that you do." You often hear people talk about creating culture, and that's so true. The environment you establish is one that either cultivates and fosters collaboration, accountability, and shared goals, or one that checks things off a long list of projects that don't have a collective purpose, and as a result drives inefficiencies and stalls growth. But the culture has to start at the top down and be felt throughout every corner of the company if you're going to land the aircraft carriers successfully. Thankfully, but not surprisingly, because I did the research, I hit the culture jackpot when I joined Ruby earlier this year. But me getting that right had to be preceded by me getting it wrong, and not just once, but a couple of times. So let's go back to a job I had many years ago. I was young, I didn't understand the things I should have cared about when joining a new company, and I made the wrong decision. And I would stay there for a few years trying to force my values on a company that had different ones. Every day I would come to work and there was this lingering scent of fear in the hallways. Fear of coming to the office late. We badged in and out and we weren't hourly and had people watching us, and it just felt uncomfortable. There was fear of trying something new. There was fear of challenging the status quo because new ideas weren't welcomed. There was fear of doing something that was outside of your core area of responsibility. You were told to stay in your lane. There was fear of speaking unless you were spoken to. And probably the most palpable fear was the fear of repercussions if you made a mistake. And I had witnessed firsthand people being asked to submit their resignation for trying something and making a mistake, taking a chance and getting it wrong. And these were good people genuinely interested in growing the company. So I was early in my career and I didn't know what good or bad leadership looked like. But over time, I knew that I couldn't answer yes to the question, am I safe here? And while I was successful in my role, that didn't mean much to me or the company. I was often sought out as the person that you gave a project to if you needed to get it done quickly and done correctly. And because I was just a few years out of college, I wasn't great at collaboration and I didn't have a role model in this company to help me navigate and build this skill. So my boss once told me in passing that I needed to add some velvet to my sledgehammer, insinuating that I was good at getting things done because I would knock over everything in my path to get it done, and no one wanted to collaborate with me. And I didn't recognize this at the time, but he was right. And instead of teaching me, which arguably was his job, we never talked about it again. This leadership I so desperately needed was absent. So trust was never established with me, with my team, or with other teams. Now, looking back at that time at the company, there were examples of good things that I witnessed, but there were very few examples of vulnerability that I saw. The lines of communication were broken. And not only did they lose me, they lost a lot of talented people who didn't find belonging. But here's the thing, I have no regrets at all about my time that I spent there, because I would move on to then meet amazing examples of what good leadership looks like. People who would push me and support me and encourage me to move out of my comfort zone. They led with vulnerability. By them building community, I learned so much about myself, the things that mattered the most to me, the kind of leader that I needed to work for and learn from, and the type of company that I needed to belong to for the hours I spent working there to be meaningful and rewarding. So what does vulnerability actually look like in action? You see some examples here. Questions like, I'm not sure I can handle this alone. Can you help me? I'm worried I won't be able to get this done in time. What are our other options? And I take full responsibility for that mistake. I was wrong. If you don't have a safe environment, none of these questions can be asked by your team. They will live in the fear that I experienced, and many today do experience, where real innovation and breakthrough moments are stifled by this fear. The most important aspect of getting people brought into a group or a team is giving them the opportunity to experience the culture themselves, which has to include leading with vulnerability. It's one of the reasons why I joined Ruby. And having worked with our CEO, Kate Winkler, before, I knew exactly the type of culture she would continue to build upon after our founder, Jill Nelson, turned over the reins last year. I wanted to be part of this team. Belonging to a purpose-driven company, deeply rooted community, both inside and outside the company, was exactly the place I needed to be at this point in my career. Alignment at the top, this is where a culture that leads to greatness starts. So to lead with vulnerability actually takes intentional effort. For some, this comes naturally. I have a human-first approach to leading teams and maintain constant open lines of communication with my team and others within the organization. I learned the following 4 rules of vulnerability through years of observation, practice, failure, and eventually success, and then continuous refinement. This pandemic has challenged me and a lot of the community personally. If you are in a leadership position, your team is looking for you to reinforce that safe environment now more than ever. Whether it's an employee that's struggling to balance working in a distance learning environment with their child, or an employee who is single and their mental health is being taxed by the isolation and the lack of community that they crave, that's hard to replicate outside the office. This is hard now. Acknowledge it. We're going to spend some time talking about the 4 rules of vulnerability and then discuss some ways to encourage vulnerability in your organization. Rule number 1, define your path. Vulnerability should serve as an objective. It should help us get from here to there. It can be a small or big transformation, but with anything in life, you need to understand what you're trying to accomplish. You won't know where you're going unless you chart your path first. I shared with you earlier, I thought I was going to be an investigative reporter. I met Paul, a reporter with the Washington Post, more than 25 years ago, and he inspired me to major in journalism. I went to school, studied hard, ran the student newspaper, and graduated with a job. And what I realized in those first 10 months that I worked as a reporter was that I actually loved storytelling. I had defined my path and then realized I needed to redefine my path. I would go on to redefine my path many times throughout my career, and it always started by answering the question, what am I trying to accomplish? However you do it, however your path continues to evolve, document a plan, chart your course, and go get it done. And lead that way with your team as well. Rule number 2, you can't prevent mistakes. We're all human. Mistakes happen. Pretending they don't doesn't help anyone. In fact, many believe that if you're not making mistakes, then you're not innovating and growing both as an individual and as a leader. I happen to be one of those people. Vulnerability allows us to look at those mistakes head on and accept them so we can do better next time. One example that sticks out in my career is when I was involved with the acquisition of a company. I had never been a part of something like that before. I was in charge of all of the communication, both internally and externally, and we had planned to go join their company all hands and announce the acquisition. We had breakout sessions planned with topics and brochures, all intended to create a new sense of belonging in our company. The problem was I didn't research our audience. I didn't understand how this new employee base was different from our current employee base and how different our cultures were. And most importantly, I didn't understand the things that were going to be most important to welcoming them into our company. I approached it with a very pragmatic approach. We had all the right pieces in place. They just completely missed the mark. And instead of building the community, the acquired employees felt disconnected, betrayed, and blindsided by the acquisition. We made this event about us instead of them. This didn't become apparent until we were in smaller groups and they felt that they were comfortable then sharing what they were feeling about the acquisition. We talked about expected work attire in the field, not realizing that they didn't have discretionary money to go buy what they felt was a uniform, nor did they want to wear one. We immediately reduced their PTO policy to match ours, something that was met with a lot of backlash. And then we introduced a 401k matching contribution that they didn't have with their current company, but only 25% of the employee base actually participated in the 401k plan. So they really didn't care about that. As we were leaving, I knew that we had work to do. We had to fall on the sword and admit that we got it wrong. We had to listen to their concerns and feedback and adjust our plan to rebuild the trust that was broken from the very beginning. And the time lost by getting it wrong was a missed opportunity to hit the ground running. But the recovery plan was swiftly put together and executed, taking everything we learned and doing better. The next time I was involved in an acquisition, I got it right. But that wouldn't have happened if I didn't get it wrong the first time. So rule number 3, trust in the expertise of your team. A leader is often measured by their team. As the people in charge, our job is to be the roaming catalyst, helping remove obstacles and roadblocks where the team has been unsuccessful and charting a course for them to remove those obstacles themselves. We should encourage ownership of purpose in everyone. Hire smart people, hire people smarter than you, and encourage them to own their business and own their outcomes. Micromanagement breeds mistrust and also doesn't result in the best outcome. Your job is to create the environment that gives people permission and accountability to get things done. My team routinely hears me say, "This is your area of expertise. I want to hear how you think we should solve this problem." I'm not qualified to do your job. And I mean that. This rule, trust in the expertise of your team, is part of my current reality at Ruby. Small businesses don't know about virtual receptionists and chat specialists. They equate our services to an answering service. And since there are millions of small businesses in our total addressable market, we can't possibly market to all of them. So we've got to be smart about how we get in front of our potential buyers. And as a result, we spend a lot of money on paid search, as do most companies. This is one of the largest customer acquisition channels that we have. And I need to make sure that we are spending those dollars wisely. And I count on my paid media digital specialist to spend that money wisely. And while I understand the channel and how to use it, the ins and outs of the strategy are owned by the Demand Gen team. They are encouraged and expected to be in the weeds every day, adjusting the strategy and executing. I have to trust them to do their job because they are the experts. They are staying on top of digital trends and trying new things out like YouTube advertising to see if that's going to work to build awareness and acquire customers. And guess what? They do it better than I ever could because they are the experts. Trust in the expertise of your team assumes that you have the right players in the right roles. If you feel like you've got to go deep into the weeds, ask yourself, are you doing that to learn or to double check their work? If it's the latter, you have to make a change. You cannot be successful as a leader if you don't trust your team to do their jobs exceptionally well. Okay, the last rule of leading with vulnerability, number 4, consider how and when you give feedback. There is a big difference between being open and sharing every thought that pops into your head. Consider your audience and consider the usefulness of your feedback before you share it. Avoid giving sandwich feedback. We've all been there. Praise, feedback, then more praise. On the surface, it sounds rational, right? Don't just deliver the negative feedback, but give praise for the things that are working well, and then deliver the negative feedback. Don't do this. It's confusing to the person on the receiving end of this feedback, and the ability for that person to process real time and ask for help is impossible to expect. Instead, be direct, supportive, and clear on expectations. Bring specific examples, not generalities, so that they can be objectively reacted to instead of emotionally. Remember, vulnerability requires empathy. If you're not considering the other person's feelings and giving them something of value, you're not being an effective leader. You would be surprised how many people never receive negative feedback because instinctively, people don't want to give negative feedback because they don't like to receive it. Many of the tough conversations that I've had throughout my career have resulted in, I've never received feedback about this before. And either they're in denial, which sometimes is the case, or they genuinely have never heard that feedback before. I usually schedule time or use scheduled time already on my calendar unless it requires immediate attention. Proximity of time to the activity that triggered the conversation is important. Don't reference something that happened months ago if you didn't address it then. The other key thing to consider is to match their personality. And this is where empathy comes in. Read their reaction to the feedback. Pause and give them time to process. Be vulnerable and share a plan, share a story that might be applicable to where you also receive feedback that wasn't what you expected to hear. And then listen. And after all of this, come out with an actionable plan and next steps for a check-in on progress. Repeat yourself in the form of a recap so that they got the headlines and the narrative below it. And if helpful, follow up in writing. Okay, so right now we've just been focused on negative feedback, but it is equally important to deliver positive feedback too. I was just having a conversation last week with a member of my team and pointed out several positive outcomes that they didn't even know they influenced. Use language like, I appreciate you. You would be surprised how much these small actions actually drive loyalty and increase performance. Incidentally, my husband also reminds me that I need to not just point out the things that he does wrong, but also praise the things that he does right. Last night, I told him what a great job he did working with the kids on their homework, which seemed trivial because we do it every day, but he needed to hear that, and so do your employees. Okay, so let's transition to how you can encourage vulnerability. First off, you have to be the example for your team. If you do not display vulnerability, which isn't just about sharing your concerns and fears. The whole message is around building a culture of belonging. Remember those 3 key elements we talked about earlier? You are part of this group. This group is special and has high standards, and I believe you can meet those standards. Lead through examples. Let others in on why you made that decision and give gratitude to someone who helped you complete something you couldn't have done alone. Ask them how they're feeling about their work. If you're struggling with something, share that with your team. Encourage your employees to share their questions, doubts, hopes, concerns. I want to share something really special that happened a few weeks ago. I posted on LinkedIn about a meeting I had with my sales and marketing leaders. I started off the meeting by checking in with the team like I always do. And after everyone said they were okay, I shared that I wasn't okay. The day before, I'd had a bad day. Nothing really happened. It was just another day. But I was overwhelmed with feelings of failure, the backlog of work, the push and pull of parenting and working from home, the lack of date nights with my husband. I hadn't seen my best friends who I needed to check on and spend time with. It all came to a head, and in front of my leadership team, I started crying. Not an ugly cry, and if I wasn't on camera, I don't think anyone would have even noticed me crying. This was just a raw and real moment, and one I'll remember for the rest of my career. At that moment, my team embraced the safe environment that we have been talking about throughout our time together today, and we all shared how we were feeling together. This wasn't manufactured. This was authentic because I lead with vulnerability, and we came out of that meeting a stronger team. Now, I'm not saying that you need to cry in front of your team to lead with vulnerability, but I kept the lines of communication open in the spirit of building a culture of belonging. And my team reminded me that I am part of this group. This group is special and has high standards, and they believe I can meet those standards. Another way to encourage vulnerability is to offer support. You shouldn't expect everyone to have all the answers, and similarly, you shouldn't think that you have all the answers. At Ruby, everybody has an SOS button, and if you hit that button, someone will turn around and ask, how can I help? This allows us to take care of problems as soon as they come up. And beyond that, people who often get help then pay it forward. They take the time to say, I just had this problem, here's how I got it solved, perhaps this can help you too. Support, whether big or small, can keep your team focused, create efficiencies, and provide learnings when you encourage sharing across the team. Again, you can't manufacture this. Consider just making this part of your leadership and management style. In addition to giving people the encouragement and room to ask for support, your business should also encourage collaboration and also encourage out-of-the-box thinking when it comes to collaboration. Oftentimes we think about collaboration and it can only happen with the folks inside your organization. Not true. If you're looking for inspiration for tackling a new problem, absolutely encourage collaboration both within your team and cross-functionally. But also there are experts outside of your organization that are likely willing to jump on a call and work through something with you or your team. I recently introduced our digital expert to another digital expert that works for one of my favorite marketing leaders. Not because either of them was struggling with a specific problem, but for them to share what they are both doing to adjust their strategies in light of COVID-19 and seeing if there's anything we should consider adjusting in our approach that we hadn't thought of. Collaboration shouldn't feel or be seen as a weakness, but rather a way to get the best team together to come up with the best idea that's going to drive the desired outcome. And again, lead by example. One of the most effective ways to encourage vulnerability is also to encourage new ideas. We talked about this earlier. I once worked for a company where I feared repercussions from suggesting a new idea. I had no doubt the lack of innovation and trying new things stalled that company's growth. Like many businesses, we are constantly innovating here at Ruby. However, innovation tends to result in scope creep, and every new idea or opportunity can't be additive without also changing something else. We know that innovation is also only one element of our purpose, and it's not always the most important element. So we empower our teams to ask, how does this link to our purpose? And what is the priority relative to our other projects that we already have committed? If the new priority is higher, we demote the other task. If the priority is lower, we put it in the queue behind the current task. If the priority of both tasks is the same, we talk about additional resources that we need to do to commit this both simultaneously. Being honest and getting everything out in the open not only feels good, but also allows us to execute faster and smarter. And being agile with new ideas that deviate from the original path is where true innovation and growth can really happen. So there are a number of ways that you can work to encourage new ideas in your organization. As Ruby's Chief Marketing Officer, I hold office hours to meet with everyone. Sometimes I schedule them, and other times I offer up a block of time on my calendar and encourage the team to meet with me. At these meetings, there's no agenda. Everything is on the table, from talking about how they're feeling to career progression to personal topics that they want to discuss and new ideas that they have for how we can grow the business. My goal in these meetings is to listen, provide empathy, guidance when needed, and encourage new idea. During my first week at Ruby, I met with every single person on my team, and I asked questions like, what's working, what's not working, what keeps you up at night, what keeps you coming to work every day, what ideas do you have for something that we should consider doing changing? This can also be facilitated in the form of a start, stop, continue to capture the same sentiment. And out of those 30 conversations, I had a list of things that we were going to need to tackle. Some of them were really easy and some of them were really hard. In my first 30 days, we tackled some of the easy, but also some of the hard ones. I set the tone for 1, I hear you, 2, your ideas matter, and 3, our idea is to get stuff done. The other thing about encouraging new ideas is to not create an environment where you need to be brought in first and consulted. Empower your team to come up with those ideas and execute them and see what happens. Don't be a bottleneck to the innovation. Encourage it and support it. So we've talked a lot about feedback. Eliminating barriers to feedback, both being received and delivered, is so important. Once you create that culture of safety for receiving and delivering feedback, this will become part of your normal routine. Part of eliminating the barriers to feedback is simply listening and taking action. Be the example for your team. Share feedback that you've received and what you're doing about it, both positive and negative. This will open up a whole new world of opportunities for improvement. Look for real problems. As a leader, it is hard to not get fired up when somebody brings you a problem that they are equally worked up about. But teams get stuck for all kinds of reasons. This product doesn't do what I needed to do. If only we had A, B, and C, then I could close so many more deals. We can't get this done because of X, Y, and Z. We tried to get this done before and it didn't work, so we just gave up. And sometimes they're manufacturing a problem that doesn't exist. It exists in their mind, but it isn't going to change their situation if that problem were solved. While it's on the leader to offer up a suggestion and acknowledge the problem, you should also be encouraging your teams to work through these obstacles on their own before bringing them to your attention. Questions like, what have you already tried to do to address this? Who have you talked to? What is the expected impact to the business if this problem is solved? And is there a way around this problem that doesn't require a lot of effort? One of the problems that was raised in my first few weeks at Ruby was around the tools that we were using to run our sales and marketing operations. It was clear to me that these weren't the right tools that we needed to scale the business, but it was also clear to the team that these weren't the right tools for them as well. This is actually a real problem that we needed to solve fast. So I empowered them to make these big decisions. Select vendors, spend budget, build a plan, execute and launch without disrupting the business. And then magic happened. What normally would take 90 days got done in 30 days. We stood up 2 major pieces of our tech stack, and during the process, we discovered problems that we didn't even know that we had. So we made a list, we prioritized them, and then got to work. One glaring example of the success of their efforts was reducing our lead distribution time from 30 minutes to under 60 seconds. So this is a prospective buyer that tried to reach out to us and learn more. We can now follow up with them immediately before they have a chance to move on to another service provider. It was game-changing for us. So my counsel to you is look for real problems and then partner with your teams to solve them. And then the last lesson for encouraging vulnerability is arguably the most important of them all. Make it clear that it is okay to fail. Not every problem requires a full-blown project plan to solve. Being scrappy and agile and testing something before investing a lot of effort in trying to solve a problem when you don't fully understand if it'll end up working can actually help you better lead your team. Mistakes are going to happen. Failure should be expected, and that's okay. Life is a learning experience. Acknowledging the problem, acknowledging why it didn't work, and moving on is critical. Take ownership and don't assign blame. When people know it's all right to make mistakes, they tend to realize those mistakes faster and solve problems gracefully. And again, failing and learning together is how trust is forged. A lot of companies say this, and even more leaders think that they encourage this, but often it's actually not the case. This is potentially the biggest lesson that I've learned over the years. The best idea wins, not just my idea. Fail fast, fail often, and learn from everything. All right. So to wrap things up, I wanted to leave you all with a clear set of priorities to consider: alignment, encouragement, and problem solving. So here are some ideas for taking these lessons that we've talked about today and turning them into immediate action in your organization. Over-communicate to your team that you're listening. Spotlight your fallibility early on and create a safe zone for others to understand that you're not perfect, and give specific examples when they can relate and ones that they can relate to of mistakes you've made throughout your career. Embrace the messenger. They are trying to lean in. Spend meaningful times with thank yous and demonstrate appreciation. We have something called Ruby Raves, which are physical, and now they're virtual, thank you notes that we send to our colleagues. Be painstaking in the hiring process. Getting this wrong can set you back and alienate your current team. And on the flip side, eliminate bad apples. Coyle's research showed that over time, keeping folks on your team that you know aren't a good fit have lasting effects on the team and the overall company's growth. Create a safe environment. We've talked a lot about this today, and it is so important. Make sure everyone has a voice. Pay attention to moments of arrival and create that belonging effect that we talked about as well. Avoid giving that sandwich feedback. We talked about that earlier. Be direct, supportive, and clear on expectations. And lastly, embrace fun. We spend the majority of our time with our colleagues, and they should feel like a second family because you have such a tight alignment around purpose that they have a personal interest in your life as well. Last night, my team hosted our virtual happy hour / trivia night that we do every other week. And while it's optional, everybody wants to participate. That's what belonging creates, a desire to spend time outside of work with your colleagues. When you've achieved that, you're doing a lot of this right. For those that are curious, I took last place in last night's trivia. I was very disappointed. Okay, I know that this was a lot of information. I hope that you found that valuable. With that, Faustine, do we want to see if we want to open this up to questions from the audience?
Yeah, so if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat option or the Q&A. We'll go ahead and answer Mary's question. Mary wrote, I have an employee who strives in perfection and does not want to make mistakes as she sees it as a weakness. What are some exercises or tips that can help her see that mistakes are okay and that they are opportunities to learn?
I think you have to match that fear that she has. So perfection is impossible to keep up with as a measure of success. And I think that finding ways to allow her to understand that sometimes done is better than perfect. And it is something I have struggled with my entire life because I similarly feel like I'm a perfectionist with a lot of things, but sometimes done is better than perfect. And there are some times where the high standards really need to be met, and help her navigate which situations require which understanding of how to approach them. It is something that you have to continually remind somebody of. because you could be in a perpetual state of paralysis trying to iterate on something until it's exactly the way that you want to be, as opposed to done is better than perfect.
Great, thank you. We have Jeff who wrote, what was the rule 1 again?
Rule number 1 was define your path. So understand where you're trying to get to, ask yourself questions about what it's going to take to get there, and then check in with yourself throughout the path to make sure that you are on the right journey and see if there's anything you need to do to change your course.
Great, thank you. Allison writes, how would you deal with passive-aggressive people who make comments towards colleagues?
You know, it's actually something that Coyle addresses early on in his book on the culture code. And what was fascinating is they intentionally inserted somebody into several different scenarios that was a bit of a passive aggressive member of the team, so that they could see how different leaders interacted with that person. And honestly, the most successful leader that they found was somebody who immediately diffused the situation. So course correcting what that passive aggressive statement was about real time, consistently, eventually that behavior stopped. And I think that is something that is probably 2 things you need to think about. First off, that it can be incredibly disruptive to have somebody like that in the team. So I would work to try to diffuse it in the moment. But also, I think that having very specific feedback, direct with examples, would help overcome that. There's something that's at the root of that passive aggressiveness. It could be insecurity. It could be a project that they wanted to work on that they didn't get a chance to work on. But there's something that sits below that passive aggressiveness that you've got to uncover. And creating that safe environment and leading with vulnerability should allow that to open up. And then hopefully you see that behavior change over time. And if you don't, you really need to consider how disruptive that potentially is to the rest of your team and whether or not you need to make a change there.
Great, thank you. We also have Sarah who asks, are there any other books that you would recommend for leadership besides the one that you shared in today's presentation?
There are, and if you reach out to me, I've got my contact information, as well as Ruby's contact information on the next slide. And if anybody would like a copy of this book, the first 5 people to shoot me an email and give me some feedback on today's presentation, I'll send you a copy of the book. Give me your address and I will get it out to you today. But I will absolutely, if you send me an email, I'll share some other books that come to mind that I've read throughout the years that are really great examples of leadership styles. I've studied a lot. You know, Jack Welch winning many years ago, you know, was kind of his overview of how he approached, you know, leading at GE. And while there were some things that absolutely I found flaws with, there were other things that I really resonated and connected with.
Great, thank you. We also have one question from Mike. He asked, do you recommend HR always be involved in coaching sessions, or is that something just with the leader and the team?
My personal experience is that when I'm involving HR, it adds an escalation to the situation that makes the stakes a lot higher. So trying to diffuse and course correct is something that is more challenging when you've got HR involved in that conversation. It doesn't mean that I don't consult with HR as I'm encountering situations that I need coaching or advice on and how to navigate, but actually involving them in the conversation should be a series of activities that eventually leads to involving HR in a situation and usually results in something like an official performance improvement plan of sorts. But my advice is to, again, create that safe environment, build a culture where they know that you have their best interest at heart. Go to them with direct and honest and candid feedback with specific examples, and try to work through it through feedback loops. And then I would do, you know, very regular check-ins, keeping HR abreast of what's happening, but not involving them until you've kind of exhausted all options to work through it on your own.
Great, thank you. I think that's all the questions that I see in the chat option. But thank you once again, Rebecca, for taking time out of your busy day on a Friday to help present our webinar today. I hope this information was very valuable for all of our listeners out there today and our viewers. I will have this recording up on our events.bbcommunity.org site within 1 to 2 business days. So if you do need to review the information or share it with your colleagues, it will be posted on there as well. And you can sign up for additional webinars and view past webinars. So thank you everyone for taking time of your day to, let me see, there's one more chat. Oh, a big thank you from Kimberly as well. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you again, Rebecca. Please stay safe out there and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Be well.